Is utopia revolutionary? Fredric Jameson's analyses of not just utopianism in general, that usually is done through a philosophical lens looking at theories and principles developed, but especially literary utopias. Jameson's analyses of these renders a critique of politics that is devoid of utopianism because, according to him, without utopianism, there can be no revolutionary politics. Now, we might think this to be rather strange, especially if we think about Marx's criticism of the kind of anti revolutionary nature of the utopian socialists. So we might ask, does utopia serve any kind of a social function, never mind just a revolutionary function? And in response to this, Jameson says, well, on the one hand, there is no use utopia can provide to those who currently suffer misery, poverty, unemployment, starvation, squalor, violence, and death. What use is, some imagination of a better world to the one that's undergoing immediate injustice, immediate harm, that's experiencing immediate suffering? Yes, utopia might be useful in the long run, but for actual public policies that are addressing immediate concerns, utopia doesn't seem to be useful for them. On the other hand, Jameson says that unparalleled wealth, economic and technological production, scientific and medical discoveries unimaginable a century ago seem to have rendered utopian speculation as antiquated as pre-technological narratives of spaceflight. So if we think about, for example, the early 20th century, all these kind of futurist writers would try to imagine what the world would look like 100 years from then. And a lot of their kind of descriptions are basically like, maybe cars of the early 20th century flying, or, kind of horse and buggy type things that now are, in the air or whatever. Like, basically, we can see the kind of lack of imagination, and they take what they have now and then think, well, what can it do? But they're not really capable of imagining, for example, maybe a cell phone, or imagining a jet or a spaceship, a rocket that can take people up into space and things like that, right? They think of it within the framework of the technology they have available. So it's a car flying up to outer space or something like that. So there seems to be, even with the kind of narrative that utopianism is imagining the unimaginable, well, it seems like maybe there are actually limits even within that when we look at the kind of technological innovation that has occurred that, thinkers couldn't have predicted. So it seems like, again, utopia doesn't really have a kind of useful social function. And yet, Jameson is going to argue that utopia is the only thing that can offer the conception of systemic otherness. An otherness, a conception of a radical negation of actually existing society, of an alternate society. And that a new practical politics that wants to overcome current injustices can never occur without utopia. In analyzing utopias, Jameson says there's two different ways to think about utopia. There's utopia as wish fulfillment and utopia as construction. So utopia as wish fulfillment is the utopian world as such. It's about the things that actually the individual person kind of would experience or recognize. So he gives examples of how in Plato's Republic and in More's Utopia, you have the abolition of private property. So this is something when people ask, well, what actually occurs in your utopia, right? And someone says, well, there would be no private property. Someone can immediately think about what that would be like because their life revolves around something like private property. Or the same thing if you said, well, there's the abolition of the family or something like that. There's a kind of impulse that's existential to the listener or the reader of that utopia. So Jameson says that this version of utopia is essentially existential and therefore more vivid. That we as individuals entertain a relationship with money and greed, with property, and we are thereby led to wonder what life would be like without these things. For we are most of us employed, but familiar with the fear of unemployment and the lack of income, and not unacquainted with the psychic misery involved in chronic unemployment. So there's actually kind of way that the utopia's wish fulfillment can tap into unconscious desires. Because if you say, well, look, there would be the abolition of private property or the abolition of wage slavery or something like that, there's a way that the reader can kind of put themselves immediately into the shoes of what would that be like. Because if you experience the problems of, well, what if I lose my job? What am I going to do about getting health care if my health care is tied to my employment? And so they're reading about a utopia where health care is provided or something like that. They can immediately imagine through the negation of their own circumstances what that would be like. What's interesting about this, though, is it's also then always from the standpoint of one's own circumstances. So the abolition of private property and the way that it is going to be desired or unconsciously experienced through this kind of wish fulfillment is going to be different for someone in like 21st century capitalism as compared to ancient Greece in Athens. The second kind of utopian analysis is utopia as construction. So it's about how things work politically. It's not just where we say, oh, in my utopia, there's no private property, there's the abolition of the family or something like that. How does that actually work? And this is something that, if we think back to maybe even Marx is pretty good at offering the kind of wish fulfillment insofar as there's the abolition of private property and things like that. And yet he refrains from trying to describe how things work politically, whereas someone like the utopian socialists try to describe down to the minute detail how exactly their society would work. In More's utopia, we get an example of him describing exactly how the houses are built, how the city's constructed, and things like that. So how the utopia actually functions in carrying out perhaps the wish fulfillment. So in More, we have the division of the island into 54 cities, the organization into groups of 30 households each, the suffragants, the phylarchs, the senate, the transibors, the elected prince. We have the functioning of the households. We have a description of how marriage works, of slaves, farming duties, laws, and more. This anonymity and depersonalization, according to Jameson, is a fundamental part of what utopia is and how it functions, because that is the kind of political step that utopia takes in the utopia as construction. Utopia's wish fulfillment is important because it unlocks a kind of intuitive senses as to whether one finds a utopia desirable or not, whether they want to pursue it, whether they think it's good. But it's utopia as construction that has the more political angle of, okay, how do we actually do this? Is it feasible? Should we then actually pursue it? Not only do we want to pursue it, but should we? Jameson reads these two different utopia's wish fulfillment and utopia as construction. He reads these two analyses in a dialectical manner. He thinks it's actually paradoxical. That the utopian world as such is a radical critique of actually existing society. That when we say in the utopia, perhaps there's the abolition of private property, this is revolutionary. It is the negation of current practices. He says what is crippling is not the presence of an enemy, but rather the universal belief, not only that this tendency is irreversible, but that the historic alternatives to capitalism have been proven unviable and impossible, and that no other socioeconomic system is conceivable, let alone practically available. The utopians not only offer to conceive of such alternate systems. Utopian form is itself a representational mediation on radical difference, radical otherness, and on the systemic nature of the social totality, to the point where one cannot imagine any fundamental change in our social existence which has not first thrown off utopian visions like so many sparks from a comet. So one cannot engage in a practical politics that's actually interested in undoing specific injustices without imagining, without thinking, what would it be like? Or is it desirable? Is it good to have its negation, to have the radical other of perhaps no private property, or in terms not just the negation, but then communal ownership of property. On the other hand, what makes this a bit paradoxical is that utopia is beyond history, where the political is supposed to be over. There is no revolution in utopia. It's impossible because you're describing, right, literally no place. It is after politics. It's a kind of end of history. You have dissolved all of the contradictions in society. So how is utopia itself political if it's beyond politics? It's when we don't need politics anymore. Jameson says, you cannot abolish parliamentary representation in a parliamentary system. You cannot decide to go back to free enterprise in a communist one. Cooperatives cannot flourish within a capitalist market system. Nepotism, inheritance, and nomenclatura cannot be tolerated within a society committed to equality. A social system, in order to continue to function, must include its own built-in immunities. How much the more so in the case of the system to end all systems. So it seems like we want, for example, maybe the best kind of utopia to be one where it's open-ended. It's possible to revision. But how can you actually have the good place, the ideal place that can then be open to revision? Because it seems it's at the end. It is the end result towards which you aim, not just a stepping stone. If it's just a stepping stone, how is it utopia? But it's only by taking both of these together that we can understand the power and the necessity of utopia. By taking the utopian world as revolutionary, as a radical critique, a negation of actually existing society, with the fact that it is the utopia itself. There is no revolution. There is no politics. This leads Jameson to argue that utopia emerges at the moment of the suspension of the political. That when we are not interested, when we are not ready to change our social systems, our social practices, when we are not aware of the injustice, perhaps, of certain practices, of certain policies, that is when utopia is irrelevant. Utopia is not relevant to the politician that's actually trying to address, for example, crises. It's in moments of political stagnation, when there is no progression in ideology, or there is no progression in political policies. We might think of, for example, when there is no progression in the United States Congress, that basically is just stalled. It doesn't really do anything big anymore. We don't build anything in the United States anymore. There's no massive public projects undergoing. It all just seems kind of a managed decline. That kind of suspension of politics as a real matter of deliberation, that is when utopia is most important. That's when it's needed. It's most evident in, actually, according to Jameson, but not just Jameson, but someone like Mark Fisher in his book Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative?, when he says, he gets this line from Jameson and Zizek, that it's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. If it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, then that's when we need utopia. That's when we need to imagine the negation of this system, and an actual, not just a negation, but an alternative to pursue, that we actually think is desirable. Jameson says, politics is always with us, and it is always historical, always in the process of changing, of evolving, of disintegrating and deteriorating. I want to convey a situation in which political institutions seem both unchangeable and infinitely modifiable. No agency has appeared on the horizon that offers the slightest chance or hope of modifying the status quo, and yet in the mind, and perhaps for that very reason, all kinds of institutional variations and recombinations seem thinkable. He also says, the paradox might be explained this way, that as one approaches periods of genuine pre-revolutionary ferment, when the system really seems in the process of losing its legitimacy, We focus more sharply on very specific wrongs. The dysfunctioning of the system becomes far more tangibly visible at crucial points. But as such a moment, the utopian imagination no longer has free play. Political thinking and intelligence are trained on very sharply issues. So, can we neglect that wish of utopia, of the actually, the principles or the things like private property that, or the abolition of the family that often we claim are, when we try to implement them, they're actually end up, being dystopian. Can we kind of have utopia without the utopianism that we so often say when we try to implement it actually leads to dystopia? So can we neglect that aspect of utopia without missing everything that gives utopia its vitality as a kind of revolutionary lens to critique society with, that gives its vitality and its libidinal and existential claims on us? So again, can we have utopia without the utopia? Well, Jameson says that we are all ideologically situated. Utopias spring from a specific class position. That how we then critique society and how we, of course, then in the reverse make sense of society is informed by our specific class context. So ultimately, no, we can't just neglect that wish of utopia. Utopia is risky. As Jameson says, the utopian, to be sure, imagines his effort as one of rising above all immediate determinations in some all-embracing resolution of every imaginable evil and misery of our own fallen society and reality. No matter how comprehensive and trans-class or post-ideological the inventory of reality's flaws and defects, the imagined resolution necessarily remains wedded to this or that ideological perspective. So there is no way that you can engage in utopian thinking without being really committed to the ends of your utopian vision. And that's risky because that means you might end up downplaying certain kinds of injustices that aren't maybe privileged in or are deprivileged in your utopianism. That's ultimately a matter for politics to address. But what this results in, though, this kind of ideologically situated utopian thinking, it results in extremes, the extremes of town and country. So you might have a utopianism that, of course, think about the 19th century and maybe like the Romantics, and imagining, the country as the place to be. That's where humanity can flourish, and the town or the city is really kind of, degrading humanity, or it's changing it in negative ways. Or then you have the reverse, maybe actually the city or the town is where utopianism. So maybe someone like Iris Marion Young, for example, opposed to the country. We have extremes of human nature and society. So maybe your utopianism is about protecting and realizing human nature, not letting society corrupt it. Or maybe it's about society that human nature or our nature is constructed by society, and that is kind of the basis of your utopianism. Or again, other extremes of technology and nature, and so on. We see these in all utopias. These are evidence of the specifically ideologically situated thinking within which utopianism necessarily occurs. Jameson, though, offers a negative, what he calls a negative relationship proposal insofar as how do we make sense of this? How can we have our utopianism actually be useful for revolutionary purposes while trying to mitigate the harms? Now, we can't entirely be sure that we won't, risk perpetuating certain kinds of injustice that we obviously don't intend to do. But we can try to mitigate it through not taking one of these utopian positions of the extremes. So not just fully embracing the city or the town or the country, but instead we take them only as a critique of the other. So we take them together, but negatively. Jameson says, but what these utopian positions allow us to do is, by way of negation, to grasp the moment of truth of each term. So what we do is we accept that when we engage in utopian thinking, we are going to do so with a specific ideological lens. There is no getting around ideology. We're all enmeshed in ideology. But what we do is we try to then have a critical lens with respect to our own ideological position by viewing it with its opposite. And we then critique our own with the opposite and vice versa. So he says, put the other way around, the value of each term is differential. It lies not in its own substantive content, but as an ideological critique of its opposite number. The truth of the vision of nature lies in the way in which it discloses the complacency of the urban celebration. But the opposite is also true, and the vision of the city exposes everything nostalgic and impoverished in the embrace of nature. But the two terms must not cancel each other out. Their disappearance would leave us aback in that status quo, that realm of current being, which it was the function and value of the utopian fantasy to have neglected in the first place. Jameson ends on a note that is meant to address what he thinks is the fear of utopia, why we are so often, perhaps even unconsciously, afraid of engaging in utopianism. He asks this question: is all this, all of his kind of critique of utopianism, his analysis, is all this to say that we can form no substantive or positive picture of utopia, short of embracing all the multiple contradictory pictures that coexist in our collective social unconscious? On the one hand, he wants to say no, that we can actually pursue certain utopias over others. But on the other hand, again, we can't get around ideology. We have to accept the fact that we are always situated. And in this way, we can maybe see the politics of utopia. That in actually engaging in utopianism, we should do so in a political way, where we pit utopias against one another. We don't just try to fully embrace one utopia kind of dogmatically over the other. In so doing, is it not possible that the achievement of utopia then will efface all previously existing utopian impulses? That if we truly then want to pursue a substantive positive picture of utopia through this negative relationship critique, won't it mean that what we're actually desiring is the overcoming of utopianism if utopianism emerges only in the suspension of the political, only when we are facing injustice and tyranny and suffering at its most visible? Jameson says, I fear that we are not capable of imagining the disappearance of the former without the utter extinction of the latter as well, since the two are inextricably and causally bound together. Something is to be said for the proposition that the fear of utopia is intimately linked with the fear of aphanesis, or loss of desire. The sexlessness of utopians is a constant in the anti-utopian tradition. So he doesn't really have a satisfying answer. He doesn't think that we can, again, be guaranteed that, look, by pursuing utopianism and by kind of trying to pursue the overcoming of politics, insofar as politics hasn't really achieved justice, we can't really be sure that we're not just negating our own desires. And this goes really back to a kind of psychoanalysis, Lacanian critique, which is when we truly pursue that which we desire, we are ultimately pursuing not having that desire. We're pursuing the death of that desire. Utopianism is no different. And in that way, again, it's a kind of paradox that we are pursuing the end of utopianism when we engage in utopianism. Is it possible that a genuine confrontation with utopia demands just such anxieties that result from these utopian impulses? And that without them, our visions of alternative futures and utopian transformations remain politically and existentially inoperative, mere thought experiments and mental games without any visceral commitment. The only way to know for sure is to engage in utopianism, because otherwise all we're doing is burying our heads in the sand to the fact that we don't want to confront the injustice we experience now.